The concept of Blitzkrieg is that the enemy cannot gain a fresh foothold somewhere and offer major resistance.
It calls for certain elements, above all large armoured units that can act operationally with air support. You also need the right leadership culture.
Militarily, the focus is usually on the enemy's capital. To win the war, you have to take it.
It was, of course, important to the Germans to capture Warsaw with as few of their own casualties as possible, but they did so relatively quickly because the Poles' willingness to defend and their morale had already been broken.
During the war in Poland, Hitler had already told his military leaders of his decision to attack France.
The Germans planned to go through Belgium and act as bait, so to speak, for the Allies, but the actual destructive thrust was to take place further south through the Ardennes. It was a huge gamble, and the Germans were lucky that the French failed, tactically and operationally.
Somehow Hitler seemed to have cornered success. And Germany's military leaders also bathed in the charisma which he now exuded.
In the First World War, Germany had fought for 4 years without taking Paris. Now this had been achieved within a few weeks. Naturally, this was a phenomenal achievement that could not only be exploited propagandistically, it also made a massive impression on the German people.
Actually, the Blitzkrieg operations and the whole myth surrounding them showed how quickly battles or campaigns could be won and individual countries and armies defeated. But it was not a concept for winning an entire war.
On September 22, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union agreed on a demarcation line along the River Bug. Poland was divided up between the two dictatorships even before the fighting had ended. Tank General Heinz Guderian and his corps, as part of Army Group North, had arrived in Brest-Litovsk to celebrate the two sides' supposed commonalities with a military parade.
It was actually absurd for each side to meet with the class enemy because the Germans clearly mistrusted the Soviet Union. Old Nazis in particular were shocked at the alliance between the two, but Hitler reassured them, saying that it was only a tactical alliance and that at some point the Russians would get their day of reckoning. He said he'd had to replace one evil with another. Guderian and the Soviet general both put on a brave face.
Polish troops taken prisoner by the Germans. In the end, nearly 700,000 surrendered to the Wehrmacht. France and Great Britain had still not given any military support to their allies who were now facing defeat. Nevertheless, the Polish government still refused to declare Warsaw an open city and end the war. Hitler had ordered the capital to be bombed and shelled into capitulation. On September 25th, at the peak of its attacks, the German Air Force dropped 487 tons of explosive and 72 tons of incendiaries.
When you read the diaries of Warsaw inhabitants, the days of the aerial and artillery bombardment must have been terrible. Warsaw became a symbol that survived longer than the Germans expected. A symbol for those Polish men and women who still hoped that in some way they could hold out until the Western powers came to their assistance.
The Nazis claimed that their barbaric assault was inevitable. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary,
"We have to take the city, and if it is defended with all available means, that is also how we must attack it."
The bombing was so devastating that the Polish commander-in-chief said, "It's intolerable, we have to capitulate," and that took place soon after. There was fighting in the outskirts of the city, but by then, surrender negotiations were already in progress. So sadly, the terror bombing had achieved its goal. Morally, it had virtually broken the Polish backs. We simply had no choice but to capitulate, they said.
No city had ever experienced such horrific aerial bombardment. More than 2,500 people died in the ruins of Warsaw.
Am Morgen des 28. September marschiert die deutsche Vorhut in Polens Hauptstadt ein.
Poland's Supreme Commander, Marshal Rydz Smigli, had fled to Romania where the Polish government had already sought refuge 10 days earlier. A Nazi propaganda film reported on the capitulation of Warsaw.
Offiziere zweier Fronten stehen sich gegenüber. Die Kapitulation wird verlesen.
The last hostilities in Poland ended early in October.
There was no general Polish capitulation because the Poles had established a government in exile, and also because a large part of the Polish army had tried to escape to Romania and Hungary. So the message was quite clear. We are not submitting. We are going to fight on. Poland is not yet lost. Consequently, overall capitulation would have violated Polish honor.
On October 5, 1939, Hitler arrived in Warsaw. In the streets of the capital, the Wehrmacht honored the dictator with a victory parade. His troops had defeated Poland in less than 5 weeks. Hitler's power seemed insuperable. The Blitzkrieg myth was born.
Schon seit alters her haben Siegesparaden eine hohe
Victory parades have always had a symbolic power. They show the victorious army and present it in a special light, as a salute, so to speak. In Warsaw, we again had a victory parade taking place in the very country that had been defeated. So it was also a form of humiliation, and that is how this victory parade in Warsaw was also presented from a propaganda point of view.
Siegesparade in Warschau entsprechend propagandistisch herausgestellt.
Hitler was overjoyed at the campaign having proved victorious so quickly. I now want to attack at once in the West, he said, because the Western allies are still too weak. Time is working against the German Reich. We must immediately move our troops westward and attack France. Naturally, most of his generals were horrified to hear this.
Because of the speed with which it was achieved, the military success in Poland was massive. It had been a short war. Germany's great trauma was having to fight a long war against superior enemy coalitions. But in Poland, the Germans had succeeded in isolating an adversary and defeating it relatively quickly. That was of huge importance to how military and especially political leaders in Germany thought.
Wounded troops from the Poland campaign arrive at Korbach in Hesse. Johannes Bliesener owned a photo store. Time and again during the Second World War, he filmed events in his hometown. The Wehrmacht put the number of wounded at 30,322.
The war resulted in losses on both sides, but that is a problem in war. You lose soldiers, of course. The question is, can the losses be offset? Do they have a place in the big picture? Are the losses excessive or justifiable? And in the opinion of Hitler and his military leaders, Wehrmacht casualties in Poland certainly were acceptable.
Bandages for the wounded were in short supply. Women in Korbach helped to ease the supply problem. People were happy about the swift victory in Poland. To prevent people at home going hungry during the war, food had been rationed and could only be bought with tokens. The citizens of Korbach used their own initiative. They preserved fruit and took the produce to assembly camps.
Naturally, the fact that German politicians and public opinions thought so highly of the Blitzkrieg had a propaganda effect. On the domestic front, it showed the German people how powerful the Wehrmacht had been made. The message was, if we have defeated Poland in 4 weeks, how long will we need for other adversaries?
Johannes Bliesener also filmed the funeral of a soldier killed in Poland. The Wehrmacht claimed to have lost 13,981 troops. No comparison with the horrific losses of the Polish army.
The Wehrmacht
did not, of course, achieve victory over Poland without incurring its own losses in men and material. Germany had mainly suffered losses of a material nature. This meant that the Wehrmacht would not be able to embark on another campaign in the West straight away. It would need several weeks or even months to refit and reinforce its units to be ready for a new campaign.
The armaments industry was working flat out to supply the Wehrmacht. Above all, the Air Force urgently needed more planes. With 285 lost and 279 damaged, 29% of all the aircraft used in Poland needed to be replaced. U-47 on its way to the dry dock at a Krupp shipyard. It was filmed by a Nazi propaganda team because the submarine had achieved a spectacular success. On October 13, 1939, U-47 broke through the British sea blockade and entered Scapa Flow, a body of water in the Orkney Islands in Scotland. Basically, it was a suicide operation.
The German Navy was very weak and had far too few vessels, so it was highly important to the Navy for it to achieve at least symbolic successes, and that was the case when, captained by Günther Prien, U-47 entered Scapa Flow and sank the British battleship Royal Oak.
Günther
Prien's coup in entering Scapa Flow and sinking a British battleship was just what German propaganda was waiting for. Apparently, it showed the vulnerability of the Royal Navy, and at this early stage of the war, it also demonstrated the courage of German U-boat crews. And an additional element of special importance was that Prien was a Nazi Party member. He had joined in 1931, so this was the perfect scenario for a propaganda campaign.
Together with his unit, Lieutenant Edgar Forsberg of the 257th Infantry Division was sent to Krakow, and from there to southern Poland. A book printer from Berlin, for many years he had also been a keen amateur filmmaker. Known as the Bear Division, his unit was stationed on the Slovakian border.
One effect of the war was that young German men were suddenly being taken out of a regional setting where, as a rule, they had spent their whole life. The crucial issue is that outside Germany, they were the masters. They could actually do what they wanted. The difference from being at home was that in occupied areas, and especially in the east, they were in a legal vacuum. And that's totally uninhibiting. Naturally, it led to troops becoming coarsened. As a result, looting and rape and other offenses against the civilian population became part of the daily agenda.
Galicia had been a center of Yiddish culture for centuries. Around 800,000 Jews coexisted, more or less peacefully, with Ukrainians and Poles. But, according to official Nazi doctrine, they were subhumans. And as soon as German troops occupied Galicia, a reign of terror began for the Jews. They were recruited everywhere for use as forced labor. The 257th Infantry Division was relocated to the Saarland, a train journey through the Nahe Valley. After France had declared war on the Third Reich, the border between the two countries had undergone particular fortification. All road and rail links had been cut, bridges were blown, and for security reasons, villages in the border region evacuated. Soldiers whiled away the time in various ways.
It was the time of the Phony War, which the French called the drôle de guerre, the funny war, because they'd just be sitting in their bunkers opposite the Germans. It became clear that the Germans thought little of France's ability to resist them militarily, because fraternizing scenes took place, where the French would shout across, "Don't shoot, we've nothing against you. It's just the British who are pushing us into war." Consequently, the Germans and Hitler himself gained the impression that the French didn't want war. If we attack, they thought, we stand a good chance of overcoming the French.
The two armies eyed each other on the border for months, waiting for the order from Berlin or Paris to attack. In the Saarland, the deceptive peace was broken occasionally by a few shells being fired. Since the start of the war, there had been repeated skirmishes on Germany's border with France. On September 7, 1939, French troops had advanced onto Reich territory between the Moselle and the Palatine Forest.
Sie dringen nur wenige Kilometer ins Deutsche Reich ein.
They penetrated only a few kilometers into the German Reich. Theoretically, they could have gone a lot further, but that is not what they wanted. That was not what politicians, nor indeed the military, had in mind. The French wanted the Germans to attack first.
Occasionally, French reconnaissance units were taken prisoner. The soldiers were first given something to eat and then crammed into a holding area. Since the invasion of Poland, Germany's supreme commander had only worn the grey tunic of a soldier. He had wanted to command the attack on France ever since October. But time and again his generals found a reason to postpone it. The dictator was getting impatient.
In all, the date for the attack in the West was postponed no less than 29 times, and each time the armed forces were put on the alert. Get ready, they were told. In 3 days we move. This, of course, was extremely tiring and frustrating for the soldiers who should have been told, you first got 6 months to take a rest and exchange pleasantries with the French, but instead they had to remain constantly on standby.
The fact that there was a break, a time window, was of crucial importance to the Wehrmacht. The troops needed to be refreshed and reinforced, and, of course, units had to be refitted. What is more, military leaders needed to reflect on how well their approach in Poland had functioned militarily.
The French armaments industry had not been idle either. It was producing artillery pieces and shells for the forthcoming defensive battle against the Germans. And the French too placed great faith in their tanks.
At the time, the French had one of the most powerful armies in the world. They also had extremely strong armored units and formidable artillery, but they were short of anti-aircraft weapons, so they had set certain priorities, and they had, of course, invested a great deal in defense in the Maginot Line. Their view was, why should we attack the Germans? For the time being, we are safe, and time is on our side. If the Germans want to defeat us and win the war, they will have to try and attack like they did in the First World War, and that can only take place through the Benelux countries.
How would they strike this time? Through Alsace-Lorraine as in 1870? Through the Low Countries as in 1914? What was the 1940 model conquest? The French considered the Maginot Line utterly impregnable, and therefore believed the Germans would again try a swing through the Low Countries, as in 1914.
Back then, the Schlieffen Plan failed. Even in 1914, in southern Belgium and northern France, the Western Front sank into bloody trench warfare that devoured more and more men and material.
The frame of reference for the higher ranks of the military was, of course, the First World War, which they had personally experienced. Even though 15 or more years of military development had passed since then, it was how they first looked at plans for a war against France. So for them, the concept of attacking France was always linked to memories of 1914 and the campaign back then.
The chief of the General Staff of the Army High Command, Franz Halder, had plans for an attack through Holland and Belgium drawn up and presented them to Hitler. But the Führer himself still had vivid memories of war in the trenches, which he had experienced for years as a dispatch runner. Halder, however, saw no alternative.
Hitler said that Halder's plan reminded him of the Schlieffen Plan in the First World War. The French already know it, he said, and you don't make the same mistake twice. The concept is totally lacking in imagination. I don't think Halder had any better idea. I think it was the best he could come up with, because for him the Maginot Line was impenetrable. So Halder saw attacking through neutral Belgium once again as Germany's only option.
Since the end of the First World War, the French had extended and reinforced the bunker constructions in the Maginot Line. The aim was to give the Germans no chance against defensive lines that were heavily manned and ready for action.
So the French massed 78 divisions here along the border of Belgium. 17 were in the Maginot Line. 10 divisions here in case Mussolini got bold. 3.5 as a safeguard against Spain. The British had 10 divisions here. The Allied strategy in the event of an attack against the Low Countries was to swing their armies like a gate into Belgium, the hinge being the north end of the Maginot Line. This all-important hinge was protected by the forest of the Ardennes, a hilly and thickly wooded area, honeycombed with streams, its roads narrow trails, its bridges too weak for military vehicles. French strategists estimated the forest of the Ardennes impassable for armored forces. As you will see, this was one of the costliest estimates in all military history.
When he first saw this initial plan of attack, the Chief of Staff of Army Group A, General Erich von Manstein, was horrified and developed his own plans. Although independently of each other, at the same time both Hitler and Manstein had very similar ideas, but neither knew of the other's thoughts, and Halder tried to the very end to prevent Hitler from getting a glimpse of Manstein's ideas. That's because Halder did not believe that a thrust through the Ardennes, through an extension of the Maginot Line, would prove successful, and certainly not with powerful armored units. Right to the end, he stuck to the idea that the main attack had to come through Belgium.
All winter long, German units practiced the mobile warfare that had proved so successful in Poland. Dive bombers would make it easier for infantry to advance, while flamethrowers would eliminate defensives' positions. And once again, hopes rested on the power of the armored units.
Manstein looked at the deployment of the enemy's forces and the topography and identified a definitive weak point, the Ardennes. The French were not expecting an attack from that direction. They were preparing for a massive German armored offensive, but not through the Ardennes. Even German military thinkers were against the Ardennes.
At some point, Hitler learnt of the daring idea of taking a tank army through the Ardennes. Hitler did not know Erich von Manstein personally, but an opportunity soon arose for a meeting in the Chancellery in Berlin.
Hitler had received the newly appointed commanding generals and informed them of their new role. After the meal, he asked Manstein to stay behind and talk to him. Hitler himself, Manstein said, liked to hold forth and often didn't allow people to finish what they were saying. But this time, Hitler listened. And afterwards, he told Manstein he was surprised. The ideas he voiced were the very ones Hitler had had already.
Afterwards, Hitler is reported to have said, "Sometimes you need someone like Manstein." The dictator was impressed, and Halder and the other military leaders had to shelve their resistance.
Die Frage, ob man diesen Plan sabotiert oder
The question of whether this plan could be sabotaged or Hitler dissuaded from following it just never arose, I think, because Hitler's popularity was undisputed.
Im Militär selber natürlich inzwischen durch diesen Erfolg schon
And through the success in Poland, he had, of course, also won respect in military circles. So the small number of people who viewed Hitler critically and saw themselves perhaps as opposition realized that their position was totally marginal, and that in this situation there was absolutely no point in sabotaging the plan.
On March 23, 1940, the Nazi Public Welfare Organization in Korbach invited people to enjoy a pea and ham stew on Adolf Hitler Square. On Armed Forces Day, the Nazi leadership wanted to promote solidarity in the community. After the successful campaign in Poland, most people hoped that, as in 1938, diplomacy would soon bring peace again. But for Hitler, it was clear that France had to be defeated.
Im deutschen Offizierkorps und besonders in der Generalität gab es teilweise
In the German officer corps, and especially amongst the generals, in some cases there was massive resistance to a campaign against France. The background to this was that in the First World War, Germany had failed to defeat France. As a result, many generals wondered whether Germany would be successful this time, especially with an army that was still not fully equipped, not fully upgraded, and, unlike the imperial armies in the First World War, lacked in-depth quality. Thus, resistance arose amongst the generals, who constantly managed to get the start of the campaign postponed.
In spring 1940, Hitler turned his attention to a different theatre of war, Scandinavia. The Soviet attack on Finland had made the Allies aware of the strategic importance of the region. In their view, neither Stalin nor Hitler should be allowed to gain control. Neither Germany nor the Soviet Union should become an occupying power there. And Allied concerns were justified.
Norwegen ist für das Deutsche Reich im Frühjahr 1940.
In spring of 1940, Norway was important to Germany for three reasons. Firstly, Germany's northern flank was threatened by the Allies. Secondly, so were its imports of iron ore, so important to the German armaments industry. Germany obtained its iron ore from northern Sweden. And thirdly, if Germany occupied Norway, it would suddenly have new ports and could conduct the war against the Royal Navy on a totally different level. It would open the gateway not just to the North Sea, but to the Atlantic as well.
The Germans looked on warily as British warships and mine layers stepped up their operations off Norway, thus threatening Swedish ore supplies to the Reich, which took place mainly through the Norwegian port of Narvik. Early in 1940, Lieutenant Commander Briggs took this footage on board HMS Ivanhoe. The British cruiser was operating in the Norwegian Sea, searching for German submarines in order to attack them with depth charges and sea mines. The Royal Navy also had to protect British merchant ships heading for Britain in convoys. In Norwegian waters, on February 16, 1940, Briggs filmed this spectacular action by a British warship.
Several incidents then took place, like the Altmark incident. A British destroyer captured the Altmark, a German supply ship that had British prisoners on board. Several German sailors were killed in the operation. Hitler was furious. The Norwegians, he said, are clearly not protecting their neutrality. In fact, Norway is about to become a British zone of influence, so he launched Operation Weser exercise, the occupation of Norway and also of Denmark. The idea had also come from the German Navy, but Hitler implemented it because he thought it had to happen quickly. Otherwise, the British would beat him to the punch.
In den Morgenstunden des 9. April landeten in zahlreichen Häfen Norwegens und Dänemarks deutsche Truppen. Eine in der Seekriegsgeschichte beispiellose Leistung.
Another Blitzkrieg, this time first of all on water.
Hier Truppentransportschiffe bei der Einfahrt in den kleinen Welt.
Under the codename Operation Weser exercise, not only was Norway to be occupied in a lightning operation, so was neutral Denmark. The Danes had actually been relying on a non-aggression pact which existed with Berlin, but the Germans of course ignored it. Copenhagen was simply occupied.
Wenige Minuten später überfliegen planmäßig Einheiten der deutschen Luftwaffe die Hauptstadt Dänemarks. Sie werfen Flugblätter ab, die die Bevölkerung darüber aufklären, dass unsere Soldaten nicht als Feinde, sondern als Freunde kommen und allein zum Schutze der dänischen Neutralität das Land besetzen. Neugierig sehen die Kopenhagener der Landung immer neuer deutscher Truppen zu.
Faced with the superior military power of the Germans and their brutal approach, the Danes fought for just a few hours before surrendering.
So werden nach einem genau festgelegten Plan alle Verbindungen und Verkehrswege Dänemarks von deutschen Truppen besetzt. Zur gleichen Zeit vollzog sich die militärische Besetzung Norwegens.
On the one hand, Hitler hoped right to the end that he could somehow come to an agreement with London, because he saw the British as putative natural allies. He only changed his opinion at a very late stage. On the other hand, the military situation was totally different. If I take Norway with its ports and airfields and so on, I can of course confront a potential enemy like Great Britain in a totally different way from me not having these possibilities, or indeed Great Britain having them, because the Norwegian government had asked London for help and not Berlin. Berlin was the aggressor.
Ohne Aufenthalt setzen sie Stoßtrupps in Marsch. Ihre Aufgabe ist es, sofort die wichtigsten militärischen Punkte in der Nähe des Flughafens zu besetzen.
Norway categorically refused to capitulate. The German invaders responded with military power.
Maschinengewehre und leichte und schwere Flak werden in Stellung gebracht, um die Küstengebiete auch von der Erde aus gegen feindliche Einflugversuche zu sichern. Das Schlüsselfort vor Oslo, das hartnäckigen Widerstand leistet, wird von deutschen Kampfflugzeugen mit Bomben belegt.
In the end, the Norwegian capital capitulated to the invaders.
Mit klingendem Spiel rücken die deutschen Truppen in Oslo ein.
But the actual objectives of Hitler's Wehrmacht were the ice-free ports in the north of the country, Bergen, Trondheim and Narvik. Just as in Warsaw, the Nazi Air Force showed no consideration for the civilian population. Wherever there was resistance, as in ports like Namsos or Stavanger, German bombers reduced the town to rubble. Like many of his subjects, King Haakon VII first fled into the interior of the country. He rejected the installation of a fascist government in Oslo. A German naval formation reached Narvik on schedule on April 9th and encountered fierce resistance.
For the German Navy, this was a gain in prestige, although many of its ships were lost or seriously damaged. Nearly all the large warships were either put out of action or suffered so much damage that they needed repairing in a dockyard. Worst of all, however, was the failure of the submarine arm, because nearly all its torpedoes were defective. In fact, there was a real torpedo crisis. U-boat commanders had almost half the British home fleet in their sights, but their torpedoes failed, which, of course, triggered a huge loss of confidence within the German Navy.
In the Battle of Narvik, the Wehrmacht suffered its first embarrassing defeat of the war. Supported by French and British units, the Norwegian army held off the invaders for several weeks, but not forever. On June 7, 1940, the King of Norway managed to escape to Great Britain by sea. Norway had to capitulate. On the Rhine, too, French troops had spent all winter observing the activities of the Germans. They were prepared for an attack on Alsace and Lorraine, but the French didn't take any action themselves. So, in spring 1940, the atmosphere here was one of tense calm.
The whole concept of defense was based on what the Germans called a strike from the hindquarters. This meant letting the enemy attack first and then counterattacking. In other words, we just have to wait, then we surge forward with our superb tank units and all the material at our disposal. The French are much stronger, and they are also getting stronger the longer they wait and force the Germans to take the first step.
In the end, Hitler set May 10, 1940 as the date for the attack. Infantry troops stationed in Bitterfeld near Halle were now also moved west. Many had been involved in the Blitzkrieg in Poland. In the months before, the Wehrmacht had analyzed the Polish campaign in great detail.
Die Koordination zwischen Panzerstreitkräften, Infanterie.
In Poland, coordination between the armored units, the infantry, and the artillery, in other words, warfare with combined arms, including the Air Force, had not functioned to the total satisfaction of the Wehrmacht. At the end of the campaign, each German division was told to produce a full report on what had gone well in Poland and what had not gone well from a military point of view. Between the Polish campaign and the French campaign a few months later, the German army made a great effort to learn from the deficits of the Polish campaign, in particular to improve cooperation between the various branches of the armed forces.
Teilstreitkräfte und der einzelnen Waffengattungen zu verbessern.
141 German divisions with more than 3.3 million troops were ready. They would be faced by enemy forces of similar strength, but the French had no idea of the Germans' plan, which Winston Churchill would later call the Sickle Cut. Hitler traveled to the Western Front in an armored train. The apparatus of government went with him, including a communications compartment with a telephone and telex center. On the night of the 9th and 10th of May, the Chancellery was deserted. Hanging next to Hitler's desk was a painting of Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor, who had defeated the French in 1871. In 1940, the Army Film Department produced a propaganda film showing the advance through the Ardennes. The title song glorified the Blitzkrieg legend. The film began with a detailed list of all the units involved in the French campaign, together with the names of the commanding officers. Tank General Heinz Guderian took the opportunity to introduce the film in a rather stiff presentation.
Im Frühjahr 1940 standen wir vor der Aufgabe, den Durchbruch durch die verlängerte Maginot-Linie bei Sedan zu vollziehen. Wir waren uns darüber klar, dass dieses schwierige Unternehmen nur gelingen und der Erfolg nur ausgenutzt werden konnte, wenn Führer und Truppen sorgfältig darauf vorbereitet wurden. Im festen Vertrauen auf den Sieg traten wir am 9. Mai den Vormarsch zur Grenze an.
Dieser Plan war in vielerlei Hinsicht durchaus.
The plan was risky in many respects. The infrastructure in the Ardennes, the road system, was not good. Secondly, the region is hilly and wooded, so it is not perfect terrain for an attack with armor. And thirdly, above all, marching from east to west always left the south flank open.
Ost nach West ist immer die Südflanke offen.
Bis ins Einzelne war alles durchdacht und vorbereitet. Am 9. Mai fällt endlich die Entscheidung. Um 13 Uhr erfolgt die Alarmierung. 10.05. Fall gelb.
5:35 Uhr.
Fall gelb, 5:35 Uhr.
On the morning of May 10th, Heinz Guderian posed for the camera once again as the German tank divisions were approaching Luxembourg. The man behind the Sickle Cut concept, Erich von Manstein, still had to wait to put in an appearance.
If we control this side of the French front, Manstein said, we will strike the enemy's flanks en masse. He will then somehow have to adopt a defensive position he's not prepared for. This will cause chaos and confusion in the ranks of the enemy. But we will be on the front foot operationally and thus able to conduct our movements from the flank of the French defensives.
In den frühen Morgenstunden des 10. Mai überschreiten die Marschgruppen die Ablaufpunkte. Zunächst gilt es, durch Luxemburg hindurchzustoßen und den Durchbruch durch die erste belgische Widerstandslinie zu erzwingen. Um 5:35 Uhr wird die Reichsgrenze überschritten. Während die Vorausabteilungen die Grenzflüsse überschreiten, beginnen die Pioniere mit dem Beseitigen der Sperren und dem Bau der Kriegsbrücken.
At Wallendorf, the 1st Tank Division crossed the border into neutral Luxembourg. At first, the invaders met with no resistance. Now it would become clear whether the secrecy had paid off.
The big risk was at the start of the Sickle Cut operation. Would the Germans get their units through the Ardennes in sufficient strength to break through the French positions? Would the French fail to react adequately? The success of the operation depended on this. Otherwise, the plan would fail at an early stage.
At the same time, a large-scale diversionary operation was launched in the north. Just as in 1914, Wehrmacht units advanced into neutral Belgium. They were supported by airborne forces, dive bombers and heavy bombers. Nazi propaganda also gave the impression that this was the main thrust by German armor. The French and the British swallowed Germany's bait.
The Allied concept of defense involved the best Allied armies, the British and the French, in other words, marching into Belgium the moment Germany violated Belgian neutrality, throwing their best armies at the Germans in the expectation that, as in the First World War, initially perhaps, trench warfare would begin. Then it would be a case of who had the most material and the greater stamina. And that is precisely what the Germans expected. They planned to go through Belgium with Army Group B, luring the British as bait, so to speak, so that they really would seek to engage in battle there. But the actual destructive thrust would come further south through the Ardennes. The French and the British did not believe that heavier units could advance through such terrain.
Die Divisionen durchstoßen in raschem, ungehindertem Vormarsch Luxemburg. Die wenigen Sperren halten kaum auf.
Luxembourg's casualties amounted to 6 wounded gendarmes and 1 soldier. Nobody was killed. The problem was that only a limited number of motorized units could advance towards the Ardennes at any one time. Behind them, A huge chain of vehicles stretched far back into the German Reich, and the heavy tanks had not even set off.
Der Polenfeldzug hat bereits gezeigt, was für ein Potenzial in der Panzerwaffe steckt.
The Polish campaign had already shown the potential of the armored units if they were used correctly. And in the Battle of France, everything was honed even more. The armored forces were combined in armored or motorized corps to form the main thrust of the attack. Victory was to be secured by a handful of armored divisions.
While the Nazi army was rolling through Luxembourg, in London a political earthquake was taking place. That same day, Neville Chamberlain had to vacate number 10 Downing Street for Winston Churchill.
Die Ernennung Churchill zum Premier am 10. Mai 1940 hat eine hohe
Churchill's appointment as Prime Minister on May 10, 1940 had a major symbolic effect.
Immer wieder
Churchill was the man who in the 1930s had warned time and again about Hitler. Now, at last, he was in power and showed his intention to defeat Hitler and the Third Reich. Churchill's speeches are famous. I have nothing to offer, he said, but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. But that is what the people of Britain needed in order to be steeled for a longer war, one that would require a massive effort in order to defeat the German Reich.
Meantime, an hour and a half after the German invasion began, Allied troops crossed the French and Belgian border to meet the advancing Germans.
Just as in 1914, French troops were given a sterling send-off. Most of the 144 Allied divisions, with over 2.8 million men, were concentrated in the north.
Der Plan funktioniert.
The plan worked. The French army had been tricked. They sent their best troops to Belgium, where Army Group B was attacking, because they reckoned that was where the main German thrust would come from and where the main battles would be fought. Army Group B made surprisingly good progress. In fact, the General Staff had to intervene and slow it down. Don't advance so quickly was the message. You're just supposed to tie them down.
In the south, in the meantime, Army Group A was heading for the Belgian border. Its mission was to break through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, and advance through to the Channel coast, cutting off the Allied forces in northern France and then destroying them. As yet, it was an open question as to whether this Blitzkrieg would also prove successful.